It's my pleasure to welcome Patrick Davies to our special event this evening. My name is Jim Cooper. I am an Associate Head of School of Humanities at York St John University, where I'm responsible for leading our programs in history, American studies and war studies. And I'm a historian of the United States, especially Anglo-American relations. So this talk really is in my wheelhouse. I've been really excited to meet Patrick and to host this talk. So Patrick Davison, he is a former UK Deputy Ambassador to the United States, and he will be reflecting on Biden's first 100 days. Patrick is a writer, company advisor, and a mentor to many people. He was a British diplomat for 25 years when he wrapped up his career as the UK's Deputy Ambassador to the United States from 2013 to 18, where he worked alongside the Trump and Obama White Houses for 5 years. Earlier in his career, Patrick served in the British embassies in Morocco, Poland, and Iran. He's been private secretary to two foreign secretaries, so Robin Cook and Jack Straw, and he also led the UK's response to the Arab Spring in 2010 to 2012. And he currently lives in Northern England. Patrick's first book, The Great American Delusion, is out now, and I'm very proud to say that I have read this book. This is a fantastic book. What I really liked about it, and is that reading the book, you actually realise it's written by somebody who understands America, who actually has that lived experience, already understands. So often in Britain, we talk about the United States, and often we forget that it's another country with its own set of rules and cultures and history and norms and so on. And what Patrick does in his book, and I wholeheartedly recommend it to our students and our audience, is it tackles the issues in America, but how America could solve their issues based on what America already has. So, for example, the healthcare system chapter, wonderful. It brought back memories for me when I lived in America for a year and wrestling with the bureaucracy of the healthcare system. But Patrick brilliantly points out the United States has its solutions already to hand in Medicare, the Veterans Health Organization, and so on. Also, it's at times a bit like a political memoir of what life was like working in an embassy, just trying to work out how to get the best benefits for your staff and sick leave, entitlements, and all. So it's absolutely wonderful stuff. So all students of America, and if you're interested in diplomacy or even want to work in the Foreign Office or anything like that, this is the book for you, The Great American Delusion. Okay, so enough from me. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Patrick Davies virtually via Zoom to York St John University. Patrick, thank you very much for doing this. I really appreciate it. Over to you.
Jim, thank you so much for that really generous introduction and for a very nice plug of my book. But what you invited me here to talk about, I think, was Biden's first 100 days and what that means for the US, and indeed what it means for Anglo-American relations. So what I thought I'd do is start by looking back over the last 3 months. I think it's Thursday or Friday this week that Biden reaches that 100-day mark, which over the last few presidential cycles has become a bit of a moment for people to look back at the presidency and see which direction it's going and what they think that means. I think it's fair to say that there has been quite a transformation from the last 4 years, from the chaos, the scandal and the noise of the Trump presidency, which culminated in that assault on the US Capitol on the 6th of January, which we all saw on our TVs, which was quite shocking to see. But I think we can say Biden got to work really quite quickly. And, in his first day in office, he started by executive order getting rid of some of the more controversial policies that Trump had put in place. Things like he removed the ban on people from certain Muslim countries traveling to the US, which Donald Trump had put in place right at the beginning of his presidency. He stopped construction on the wall along the Mexican border, which had been hugely controversial. You'll all remember Trump in his campaigning saying, we're going to build a wall and Mexico is going to pay. Well, of course, Mexico never did pay and they didn't finish the wall construction. Biden also rejoined the Paris Climate Accords. We can talk a bit more about his approach on climate change later. And he also rejoined the World Health Organization, which Donald Trump had pulled America out of in the middle of a pandemic. He started to build a a cabinet around him, which is historically diverse. Of course, the Vice President, Kamala Harris, is the first Black woman, the first woman of Asian descent, the first woman indeed to be Vice President. He has the first Native American ever to run a US government, federal government department, and the first openly gay person to run a US federal government department too. But I guess what his focus has been working to tackle the challenges of the COVID pandemic. And, you know, he's ramped up the vaccination program. Last week, I think they hit the target of 200 million doses given. And so America has gone from rather being a back marker in the Western world in the vaccination program to surging ahead. And I think very quickly will become a world leader because they have so much vaccine production capacity. He's also passed a massive $1.9 trillion COVID relief plan, which has sent checks, given money directly to very many American families. He's expanded tax credits as well to try and get money back into people's pockets who've been hit by the pandemic economically, and also to help get the economy going. And so what we've seen from that, I think, is cases now, or serious cases of COVID falling quite rapidly in the US. You're seeing the signs of reopening across the country, with the prospect of quite significant reopening by the summer. And, and lots of signs of the economy actually coming back to life, people being more confident as a result of that action that the Biden administration has taken in the first few weeks. Looking at it from an outside perspective, internationally speaking, we've also seen the Biden administration re-engaging in a way we understand an American administration to do. We've seen the Americans jumping back into conversations with their allies around trying to get back to some sort of Iran nuclear deal. We've seen significant sanctions imposed on Russia for interfering in US elections in 2016 and 2020 when they tried again, and also cyber activities. We've seen the Biden's doing much more on climate change, and him hosting his climate summit last week. 40 global leaders coming to that summit, being urged to do more, and the US themselves committing to halve their greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. So a very significant change from the Trump administration. We've also seen only yesterday the Biden administration stepping up to help India as it faces a real crisis in COVID, with supplying vaccines and so on to help there. And also, I think significantly, we've seen the announcement that US troops will be pulled completely out of Afghanistan by September, which will be the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Interestingly, though, we've, that's rather a continuation of the Trump policy, and indeed on China, where there was some speculation that Trump might be softer on China, he's continued pretty much the Trump tough line on Beijing, albeit approached in a slightly different way by trying to build alliances with allies in that sort of tougher approach to China. I think Biden has also been helped by the fact that Donald Trump has been largely silent. That may well be in large part to do with him still being banned from Twitter and Facebook, so he can't reach out directly to his supporters in the way that he could. How long that lasts, of course, is another matter. But Biden has also been really careful, I think, to not get himself embroiled in any of the sort of fallout from the Trump years. He sort of stood back as far as he could from the congressional action about the 6th of January assault on the Capitol. He's not commenting on any of the sort of tax investigations that are going on into Trump and so on. In fact, if he can avoid it, he just tries to not even use Trump's name. He says anything but the Trump word when he's referring to how he's looking to change America's approach. And we're also in this first 100 days getting a sort of a sense of where Biden wants to go. There's talk already of a massive $3+ trillion infrastructure plan that has long been needed in the US to deal with the parlous state of American roads and rail networks and airports and water systems and so on. And he's also talking about another massive $1.5 trillion American family plan, which is about making childcare and higher education more affordable and more accessible to Americans more generally. And and he's talking about some quite controversial, if you like, certainly in American context, ways of paying for this, and that's tax increases for the wealthy on their income tax, on capital gains, and also increasing corporation tax pretty much back to where it was before Donald Trump reduced it significantly in 2017. And also I think, one final point on his first 100 days, with the Floyd case last week, or the verdict in the Floyd case last week, we've seen both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris signaling their intention to do as much as they can to tackle systemic racism and the ingrained inequality that exists in the US. So I think, that's taken me 5+ minutes to talk about that. It's quite a significant record already, and if you look around at commentators in the US, there are a number of them comparing Joe Biden to Roosevelt and the New Deal after the Great Depression, and the huge influx of cash that was into the American system to help rebuild the country after the hit of the Depression. And so Biden's been, or the first 100 days has been talked about in similar terms. So, so far so good, I think, from my perspective. So, with all that being positive, what's the but is the question. And I think there are 3 parts of this. First, I wouldn't want to suggest that getting the sort of American pandemic response and the COVID relief package was easy, but actually it's at the easier end of the spectrum of what Joe Biden faces in the rest of his presidency. Responding better to the COVID pandemic is exactly what everybody expected him to do and wanted him to do. So although the Republicans didn't support or didn't vote for the relief package, broadly speaking, this is a massively popular policy and across the American public, and so it was on the easier end of the spectrum, if you like. So the wider reforms that Joe Biden is talking about, tackling systemic racism that is so ingrained in American society, the legacy of slavery, and rebalancing the economy and tackling infrastructure, these are much more significant challenges where he's likely to get greater political pushback too in a divided society, so polarized as it remains. Second, I think Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have already done quite a lot in the response to the pandemic, but what they've done is not the end of it. We're going to see a huge amount of bandwidth of this administration taking up by continuing to respond to the pandemic and what it throws at us and the impact that has on the economy. And that I think we'll see over certainly months and maybe even years. So their bandwidth to do other things is limited. And thirdly, and I think importantly for me, all those things I've talked about so far are only part of the story, and this is where I turn to my book, if you like, and in the book what I do is make the case that the US has been blinded by myths of its own exceptionalism for decades, and what has happened as a result of that is that the US has failed to tackle some deeply ingrained systemic political, economic and social problems that we will talk about. And that failure to deal with those problems has some quite serious consequences for the US and I think also the wider Western world. So first of all, what are these national myths that I'm talking about? Well, you know, they're widely known to all of us because they're embedded in our own perceptions of the US. The first is, you know, the America as the model Western democracy to which countries in transition aspire. The second is the opportunity for all of the American dream that, you know, all you have to do in America is put your mind to it and work hard and you can make it and make a better life for yourself. Third, we've got the sort of the success of the US economy. It is still, the US is still the wealthiest country on the planet with prosperity that many countries can only dream of. So, you know, there's a sense of that secret sauce, if you like, the Americas have got that others don't, that capitalist model that delivers for Americans. Fourth, you've got the concept and the myth around the thriving American melting pot where anybody can go to the US from anywhere in the world, contribute to building the country, and they will share in the country's success. And there are others around the Americans' rather purist approach to the freedom of expression, which the national myth is a fundamental pillar underpinning American democracy in a positive way. There's the concept of, you know, the greatest threat to the US comes from outside. It's from hostile powers. It's from terrorism. It isn't from within. It's not from America itself. There's the constitutional separation of the American church and state. So the myth is around that politics and religion don't mix when clearly they do. And of course, there's a whole concept of Americans and guns and how that's somehow an inseparable part of being an American. And indeed, many people would argue, many Americans would argue it keeps them safe. So there's a whole raft of myths there that are, you know, embedded in American culture. So, you know, but they're not unusual in the sense that we too, all countries have national myths. That's not unusual. So why did I write? Well, I think the longer I spent in the US, the more I realized just how widely these myths are held to be true in a way that I just don't think they are to the same degree in other countries. You know, anybody who's spent any time in the US, and there'll be many people on this Zoom tonight who have, the American exceptionalism narrative is absolutely everywhere. You just can't avoid it. Of course, it's in their politics. People standing for office will talk about, you know, the exceptionalism of America and how they or their party are the ones who will ensure that continues, or they will bring it back. It's the Make America Great Again narrative of Donald Trump. But it's everywhere else. It's in their movies. It's in their music. Look at the lyrics of country music. It's in their sport, in World Series that only have American teams in them. It's even in the sort of sermons of evangelical preachers. It's everywhere. It's unavoidable. And, you know, what I think that has done has allowed very serious problems within America that aren't unique to America, by the way. We have them too, and many other countries do, but it's allowed them to be underplayed or indeed entirely overlooked because it doesn't fit with the exceptionalism narrative. And, you know, what I think that has done has fueled this increasing polarization in US society. It's increased division. It's driven inequality. And, you know, in my view, it risks accelerating US decline if something isn't done about it, which frankly is bad for the US, obviously, but I think it's also bad for the Western world too. So many people look at the Trump administration and sort of think he was the problem. But from my perspective, Trump was, if you like, the first political manifestation, the first major political manifestation of this myth blindness. It was the US's failure to adapt to a changing world, to deal with serious problems at home, that created an environment where an inexperienced, pretty angry narcissist could get elected to the highest office in the US by making simplistic and populist promises to make America great again, or America first, and all this, playing on the fears of a significant proportion of Americans who feel left behind by that changing world we all face. So, you know, Trump, in that sense, is a symptom. He's not the cause of the problems America faces, although from my perspective, he didn't make them better and indeed made some of them worse, but he's still not the cause. And so just replacing him by Joe Biden and the return to normality, if you like, we've seen over the last 3 months doesn't solve the problem. It's not enough. And my sense is actually Joe Biden knows this, and it's part of the reason he wants to be bold. But there's a big question in my mind of how far he will be able to go and whether that's enough to resolve some of these very significant problems America faces. So just to talk briefly about what some of those challenges are, you know, I think we all have a good sense. Anybody who's watching America in this country has a pretty good understanding of, you know, how their politics is and how it's different. But it wasn't until I actually spent time in the US that I realized how flawed some aspects of American politics are. And that's, there's the obvious one, money in politics. But I don't think even I realized the extent to which money played a role in politics in the way it does, and how Supreme Court judgments 10 years or so ago basically opened the floodgates to almost unlimited money swilling around in the political system, so that actually the biggest players, if you like, are large corporations, they're billionaires, they're wealthy single interest organizations like, in the past, less so today, the National Rifle Association and others, who spend hundreds of millions of dollars to influence who gets elected and what policies they put in place, in a way that I think distorts the system. Then there's the electoral college system, which skews the choice of the most important political position in the land, the President of the United States, giving more influence to less populous rural states than it does to the more populous urban areas. It's not one person, one vote, to the point where, you know, who wins the popular vote doesn't necessarily get elected president. That's happened twice out of the last 6 changes of presidential office. But alongside that, there's also quite significant political corruption too, in, you know, the gerrymandering of constituency of district boundaries is pretty widespread, and attempts to stop it have usually been thrown out by the Supreme Court, or left largely unaddressed by the Supreme Court. So the problem continues. There's significant voter suppression, particularly in this case in Republican states, often in the South. And indeed, we've seen much more of that in recent months in Georgia, for example, where the Republicans, coming to terms with the loss of the election in November, are trying to enact new legislation in a number of states in the US to make it more difficult for people to vote. And then you've got the politicization of judicial appointments too, which as America becomes more polarized, this becomes more politicized. And we all saw what Donald Trump did in terms of making Supreme Court appointments and shifting the balance significantly in the Supreme Court. But that's not just at the Supreme Court level, it's at all federal courts. And those the selection of those roles has always been for the president to nominate. But as America is more polarized, they have become more politicized, and that sort of fuels the polarization. Secondly, moving away from politics in terms of the economy and the challenges America faces, and that's the economic inequality I've mentioned before. The top 1% of American society has got vastly richer over the last 2 or 3 decades, and certainly since the 2008-9 economic crash, many Americans, more typical Americans, have seen their real incomes decline over that time. Social mobility in the US is falling. You know, the mainstay, if you like, of the American dream was from wherever you start in life, you can make your life better and do better than your parents and continue that process. That's no longer very easy. Social mobility is lower in the United States than it is in many parts of Europe now and other parts of the world. So, you know, Denmark, Sweden, the UK, Spain, Canada, there's quite a long list. I think it's 27th in the world now for social mobility. Then we've got the, if you like, the failing American melting pot. And you know, this links into the issues around systemic racism that endures in American society. You know, African Americans and those from other minority groups suffer from much higher rates of unemployment, much higher levels of poverty. When they're in work, they earn less, even if they're doing the same jobs. They have worse health outcomes. They are more likely to be incarcerated, and when they come into contact with the policing and judicial systems, they're less likely to get justice. And so, you know, that sort of concept of this successful melting pot starts to be questioned. Jim, right at the beginning, you mentioned their healthcare system, and you know, in my view, it's broken in so many ways. The challenges of the COVID pandemic really shed light on that. You know, what happens when you have millions of people with no healthcare coverage at all, and then beyond that, millions more who are underinsured. Those are the people who do have insurance, but they still have big bills to pay when they need treatments because the healthcare insurance system doesn't cover it. And you've also got a highly deregulated, if you like, healthcare system, such that drug prices are significantly higher than they are here and in other parts of Europe, to the extent that, you know, a drug that was invented over a century ago, insulin for diabetes, is so expensive that people die because they can't afford it. It's that serious. We could talk about the scourge of gun violence too, and we can talk about that in questions, and we can also talk about the hugely partisan American media, and the way that in my view is pushing Americans to the political extremes. The lack of regulation of even major broadcasters that don't have to even attempt to be balanced in any way is pushing people to those extremes, and indeed, you know, leading to the point where Americans of different political persuasions don't even agree on the facts, let alone how to deal with the challenges America is facing. And of course, that's been turbocharged by social media in recent years too, which has been manipulated by foreign powers to try and keep America on the back foot. So what needs to be done? And I talk about this in the book too, but there are 3 areas really of what needs to be done. One is constitutional change, in my view, to reform the electoral college system, to make the appointments of federal judges a more independent process, and ideally to redefine the right to bear arms in a sensible 21st century way. The second are a raft of political reforms to deal with the challenge that I mentioned before, to end gerrymandering, to put the sort of decisions on district the redrawing of district boundaries into the hands of some independent process, to reduce the amount of money in politics significantly, to make sure that elections are overseen by independent bodies, not political parties, and so on. And then there's a whole raft of social and economic reforms, from more investment in poorer communities, in schools, in infrastructure, tackling racism, and all the things you would expect. And not surprisingly, I think what we're seeing from Joe Biden is he's focusing on the social economic reforms. They're far from easy, as I said right at the beginning, but they're certainly easier than trying constitutional change or political reform, which is always difficult. But given the threshold you need to reach to make those sorts of changes in the American system, would be extremely difficult while the country is so massively polarized. So he's, if you like, focusing on where he has a chance to make a difference, which is understandable. But I do think ultimately America can't leave aside some of those more difficult challenges, because if it's really going to get back on track and address the problems it faces, those need to be tackled as well. So to bring this back to the sort of exam question, if you like, about this evening, what does this mean for the UK and what does it mean for Anglo-American relations? I think, well, in the immediate term, it's pretty positive. Biden's renewed commitment to Western allies is reassuring after the last 4 years. His return to a sort of much more typical American approach on international issues is welcome, from climate change to human rights to the global economy and so on. And also, quite importantly, when you're engaging with the US administration, sort of getting back to a normal functioning US administration with people who know what they're doing, experts in place, is a good thing too, because for us and other countries, that makes engagement much easier and more predictable, and therefore more productive. But again, I think there's some buts here. I don't think we should all get too carried away after Biden's first 100 days. There is very much a sense of the US is back, and that is massively welcome in my view. But there's undoubtedly going to be more of a focus on domestic issues by this administration than may typically be the case in the US, because of the pandemic, because of the polarization and the challenges America itself faces. The Biden administration has been clear in its approach to foreign policy that it's got to link to back home. Americans have got to see that sort of engagement overseas is bringing something to them, not that it's just being done for the sake of engaging internationally. So that's not America first as Trump defined it, but I think there will be more of what's in it for us in decisions that America takes on its engagement overseas, which may mean that sometimes it doesn't get involved too much when we might have traditionally expected it to do so. So that's going to raise some questions for us and our allies. I think in terms of the UK specifically, we still have that special relationship. It's a term I hate, I have to say, but I use it just in terms of shorthand because of the unique intelligence, military, historic, indeed economic relationship we have with the US. It is of a different order than any other country. And so that's helpful for us in the UK. But, we're no longer in the EU, and that will make a difference. We're not that bridge now between the US and mainland Europe. We're not a country that has leverage inside the Brussels machinery that we did before. So, the US will be going directly much more often to Paris, Brussels and Berlin, Madrid and other countries than they did before. Of course, they'll come to us too, but they'll come to us with direct asks rather than how can we work together in Europe, or certainly in a different way. So I also think that the trade agreement with the US, which is so important to the UK government, now we've left the EU to try and help boost the economy when we've facing some challenges because of Brexit, that just isn't a priority for the US. It was always going to be difficult. Trade agreements are really hard. They take many years of negotiation normally. You know, the Trump administration may have said the right things about the trade agreement and have lent into that, but I wasn't even convinced that would be very quick with the Trump administration, and certainly in an America handling a global pandemic when trade policy is pretty poisonous now in US politics. It's just not going to be on their top to-do list, which makes things difficult for us. And I think, you know, linked back to this concept of the US having a slightly more emphasis on what's in it for us when they're looking internationally, we, the UK, are going to be judged even more on what we bring to the table. And so, yes, we have massive benefits from that special relationship with, you know, connections into the US administration of any colour, actually, that many other countries could only dream of. But, you know, that's going to come with, what are you going to do to help us? It's not going to be, we're not going to get any special favours, I don't think, from this new administration, understandably so. In the longer term, what does it mean for the UK and indeed the wider West? I turn back to those sort of deeper systemic challenges I think that America faces. In the longer term, we need America to start dealing with them. The fact that it hadn't, in my view, allowed someone like Trump to be elected, we saw that what that did to the US and indeed the impact that had on the world. I think, you know, Trump took the US to the brink. I never thought I would see people trying to overthrow the US Capitol building inspired by a sitting president. And so, you know, that's dangerous for America and the impact on the Western world, the wider Western world, if you have an America that's inward looking, tied up in his own problems, is clear. So we need America to address those fundamental problems so it can retain its position, if you like, of the most successful Western economy, that model of the Western system, because in the rapidly changing and quite hostile world we live in, we've seen from the last few years when Trump was in office, that those that have a different global approach, those that are hostile to the West, will not miss an opportunity to try and put the US and the West on the back foot if we give it to them. And so, as I say, America really needs to address those broader fundamental problems to make sure it stays on track and to bolster the Western system of government around the world. I will stop there because I've probably talked for much too long. Jim, I think you're still there. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. I think if we were on campus now, there'd be a round of applause. But thank you. I very much enjoyed that. It's very, very informative, very rich. I think it's going to prompt some good discussion. We already had some questions already. If people would like to do a question for Patrick, there's a Q&A box. So do feel free to drop your question in there. Whilst a few more are being added, I'm going to exploit my role as chair and ask the first question. Now, as historians, we often come up with these big overarching simplistic themes, and then we come up with an idea and then you spend like a whole module debunking it. So my big simple overarching theme or idea is this. It seems to me, and it's something I've pondered for a bit, so probably not very nuanced, but in Britain, we prefer it when the president's a Democrat. We like it when it's a Democratic White House. We just prefer, in terms of the opinion polls, people, if you ask your cabbie, you pick your friends in the pub, we want the Democrat to win, we like having a Democrat in charge. But in terms of Britain's national interests, it seems that actually we seem to be closer, or the special relationship is talked up more by Republican presidents. So George W. Bush, very close to Tony Blair, Ronald Reagan, very close to Margaret Thatcher. George Bush Sr., he probably went to West Germany first and realised that actually in the moment of a crisis, you rely on the Brits. And obviously the Democrat like Obama was like, yeah, we're not going to say special relationship anymore. We're going to look more interest, the Asian pivot type thing. They're interested to change. So from your experience in the Foreign Office, what is the sense that, is it easier for Britain to work with, or for London to work with a Republican because they're perhaps more Atlanticist, Anglophile, or Democrat, or does it not really matter at all?
It's a very good question, actually, because one of the interesting things about the difference of working with the Obama administration and the Trump administration is related to the point you've just made. And sometimes when I say this, people are a bit surprised, because people would expect me to say the Trump administration was chaotic and difficult, and as it was, and and for very much of his presidency, indeed all of it, he didn't have, dozens of roles were never filled because he didn't have the people to fill them, and so on. So it was a chaotic sort of presidency. But you're right that Trump was the president, standing for the Republican Party, and those traditional, long-standing Republican politicians do have a sort of a more instinctive connection to tradition, and therefore a more instinctive connection to Britain than many Democrats do. I mean, these are sweeping generalizations, of course, but there is a truth in them. That the sort of more conservative Americans are more likely to look particularly fondly to the UK. There, of course, people on the political right tend to put more emphasis on military and intelligence than people on the left. And so those, the relationship between our armed forces and veterans and what our intelligence services do together to keep us safe, all that is higher up the list of priorities of Republicans than it is for Democrats, who are focusing on social justice and prison reform, and which in many ways are more domestically focused. So there is something to what you say, but ultimately, we work with America across absolutely every policy area. It's not just the international stuff, which of course we do, but we also engage on sharing expertise on education reform, what has worked, what hasn't, on, believe it or not, even healthcare reform, and what has worked and what hasn't, because as you alluded to right at the beginning, the Americans have massive public healthcare systems. They're called Medicare for retirees and those with disabilities, and they're called the Veterans Health Administration for veterans. So they're running large public health services, and so we share across that too. So ultimately, that means we have a good relationship with whatever administration is in power in the US, and we work with them very effectively. But on the edges, it is true. On the margins, it is true that Republicans are more affectionate, if you like, instinctively towards us than Democrats, and that, yeah, and you can use that to your advantage.
Yes, I've definitely. Thank you, Patrick. I think there's definitely a PhD in that for someone, or at least a dissertation for somebody who might be watching. So, get in touch. I'd love to work with you on that. Anyway, so let's go on to. I'll stop being selfish now and go to the Q&A. So, question here, kind of related to domestic politics, really, in terms of I'll take them together because one of our audience asks, given the 50-50 split in the Senate, how likely do you think it is that Biden will be able to pass the major legislation that he wants? And also, will Biden have to get rid of the filibuster to ensure voter rights and avoid a future voter suppression, which would keep the Republicans in power? So I think that's the Senate questions. How to tackle the Senate is quite important there.
Yeah. Again, another good question. So thank you to whoever asked it. I think you know, the 50-50 split is makes life challenging. I have no doubt that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris would rather have that than not have won Georgia and the Senate being in Republican control, because that would have made life extremely difficult. So will that make passing legislation more difficult? Yes, clearly, because you know the Democratic Party or the 50 senators are a broad church as well. So you've got everything from the sort of very staunch Democrats like the Californians or the New Yorkers, but then you've got Joe Manchin representing West Virginia, who's, you know, the very conservative end of the Democrats, and you've got some independents too. So it's a broad church to hold together. So even amongst the Democrats, if he's trying to do more controversial things, then he's got a job to do to keep them together. But you know, the flip side of that is the Senate parliamentarian, which is this body that determines whether, you know, how things should go technically through the Senate process, depending on different bits of legislation. They have already said that on like the infrastructure bill, that can go through in budgetary procedures. And what that means is instead of needing the typical 60 votes, which you do in the Senate to pass major legislation, if it's budget related, you only need a simple majority. So if he can get all the Democrats on side, his broad church, he can use Kamala Harris to get the 51 and therefore get a simple majority. So as long as his legislation can be categorized in that sort of budget zone, then he has a way of getting things through. But the reality is that might work for infrastructure. It certainly worked for the COVID relief plan. It's not going to work on things like the voting rules to try and stop voter suppression. It's not going to work on police reform. It's not going to work on anything around sort of inequality and racism and so on. So yeah, he's got his work cut out for him. Will he get rid of the filibuster? I'm not sure about that. I think it's quite clear that he's hesitant on that. I think he will try and avoid getting into those sort of technical debates. You know, on the Supreme Court as well, he's got an independent review going on about whether they should increase the number of justices on the Supreme Court as a way of getting some balance back to the court. But that's so political to do that would be so political in a highly polarized country that I think Biden will just try and steer clear of them if they can, and only think about taking action if he really starts to get blocked in things he wants to do. So I think he's going to bide his time on those sorts of things and try and push forward his agenda. And indeed, you know, I think he's going to aim high, knowing full well that if he's going to get agreement for things, he's going to lose things in his proposal. So, you know, the infrastructure bill is pretty far reaching. He'll lose some of that maybe to get it through the Senate. If because of the budgetary procedures, he might not have to lose very much. He's only having to keep the Senate Democrats together. But he, you know, in other areas, he may be willing to compromise more. I mean, he came to the presidency with 40 plus years in the Senate, known as a moderate, a man who tries to bridge the political divide. So, you know, I think he will try that. But if he gets blocked, I think we might see him being more radical on those procedural points, I think.
I was muted. I was saying thank you, Patrick. That was a really, really expert answer there. Really helpful. Thank you. Another question from one of my colleagues is how important might Northern Ireland prove to be in Anglo-American relations under Biden?
Yeah, another very good question. I mean, I think Biden made clear even during his campaign and has made it clear since that you know, he's going to be making sure that or he will do what he can to make sure that whatever actions are being taken in London related to Brexit will not undermine the peace in Northern Ireland, will not put pressure on the Good Friday Agreement. And indeed, he is very proud of his Irish roots and plays them up quite a lot. So, I think the Biden administration will be absolutely clear with London that it won't tolerate certain actions on Northern Ireland. And that might be a little bit uncomfortable in London, to be honest. They're, veering off towards Northern Ireland and that issue. I personally don't believe there is a solution to the border, to the sort of Brexit border issue. We are now a third country, and third countries with the EU have external borders, and that external border either has to be in the North Sea in the sort of fudged way it's been done because of the Good Friday Agreement, or it has to be on the island of Ireland. And that's not going to happen because of the Good Friday agreements. And certainly America would not welcome any change there. So I think, that makes life difficult for London because there isn't an obvious solution, and yet there is a problem to solve. So we shall see how that plays out. But I think, the Biden administration's position on this is clear and isn't going to change.
Thank you. I think it's fascinating. I wrote a book about US presence in Northern Ireland and how the interest of presence in the Congress and so on. So perhaps I'll talk about another time rather than monopolise the virtual floor completely. But yeah, I think it's really interesting conversation to have. Got a couple of questions about foreign policy, and I'll take them together. If may, one about in terms of foreign policy. According to the audience, maybe you define Biden's approach as one of continuation, which you would agree with. However, would you be concerned with Biden being perceived as weak by the East? And so China's audacity to criticize US human rights while carrying out genocide, and the Russia builds upon the Ukrainian border is the largest we've ever seen. Should the West be worried? Will Biden be tough enough, really, in terms of foreign policy is a question. But also, linked status of a question about Biden said that diplomacy was key to foreign affairs. So was his airstrike on Syria in February hypocritical, or was it vital for self-defense? So I suppose really, what can we expect from Joe Biden as commander-in-chief? Really, should we be worried? Should we be comforted that he's got his finger on the button these days?
Yeah, I wouldn't say we should be worried. I think as I said in my introduction, I think broadly speaking, there's most of the Western world are welcoming America back into a more traditional place in their foreign policy, and that sort of attaching importance to Western allies rather than sort of actually doing the opposite, which is what Trump did. If we summarize Donald Trump in many ways, he cozied up to a number of dictators and then sort of distanced himself from Western allies, which is an uncomfortable place to be if you're one of those Western allies. So the shift back to a more traditional American approach is helpful, I think. Will he be tough enough? We've seen very clear language from the US on Russian build-up on the Ukrainian border. We've seen the sanctions applied, which were some of the most far-reaching sanctions. It moved into a new area around Russian debt, and so they're pretty tough from the Biden administration. We've seen the continuation, if you like, of Donald Trump's approach to China, albeit couched in more sophisticated diplomatic language, I guess, than Donald Trump was tended to use. And also with that sort of, build alliances approach. So not America going it alone on being tough with China, but trying to bring allies with him to, as the only way, actually, the only credible way, I think, of pushing back against some of the things that China is doing, which are not in line with our interests or values. So, I don't think we should be worried. I don't think we should be worried about whether Biden will be tough enough. I think, just as I said earlier, I think, there is going to be much more of a domestic focus to this administration because of the challenges it faces, not least with COVID. And so I think it's going to be more selective in when it engages, when American interests really are at stake, America and broader Western interests at stake. So it may be America won't be intervening quite so much as other administrations have done in the past, which, as I said earlier, raises questions for us and our other allies. Is do we intervene or push back against whatever it might be that's going on in the world if America isn't 100% engaged, and how do we do that, and what does that mean? But I think, I do think there's a sense of Beijing and Moscow in particular have been using this for her first 100 days to do a bit of testing of the Biden administration, not least the Russian build-up on the Ukraine border. We all saw the news coverage of the first meeting between the Biden administration and the Chinese, where it was pretty testy. I think that was China testing the new administration to see what it could get, to see whether it would be a bit softer than Trump. And indeed, the Biden administration pushed back pretty clearly and publicly. So in that sense, I'm not worried about America being too soft, but I'm also not worried about America being too gung-ho either in an Iraq or Afghanistan sense, if that's what was in the questioner's mind.
Okay. Thank you. I'm just conscious we've only got a few minutes probably left of your time, really, Patrick. So yeah. I was going to apologize if I don't get to ask everyone's question, but there's been a few questions about personalities and continuity and change. So how did Anglo-American relations change from Obama to Trump? But also from the British perspective, I mean, what would Boris Johnson's priorities now be compared to, say, I don't know, Theresa May's or David Cameron's? So how does the revolving door of the people at the top table actually impact in terms of priorities, relationships, and so on?
I mean, the change at the top, of course, has an impact. They are the senior leaders on both sides of the Atlantic, but the fundamentals stay largely the same. As I said before, because our relations with the US are so broad and so deep. I mean, they cover absolutely everything. I mean, businesses every day are working together on both sides of the Atlantic, and there's all the educational links that you know about, and there's all the cultural links, and of course there's the military and the intelligence. So the government is only acting directly in some of these areas, and those relationships are not just at the head of government or head of state level. They're at every working level. They're from the most junior official to mid-ranking people to deputy ambassadors like I was, and so on. And so, that it continues no matter who's in office. Where it becomes difficult is or more challenging is when you move from an Obama to a Trump administration, and it's challenging when that administration says things that are, one, out of line with traditional American policy, and two, more importantly, out of line with the current British approach to a certain policy issue. And then you're left with a quite hard choice. Do you publicly distance yourself from your closest ally and the world's biggest superpower, or do you try and find a way to navigate that by keeping your head down until it moves on, and maybe a new leader comes and like Biden returns to a more traditional US stance? So, I think, those were the sort of challenges we faced with Trump. Day to day, the work carried on all the sort of issues you would expect government to be working on, our intelligence community working closely together, our military working closely together, our officials working closely together as far as possible to advance our collective interests. But it's when things become public, all those very big issues, and there is a sense of divergence that becomes more difficult. In terms of the Johnson administration, I think Johnson government, they will be looking to build as close a relationship with the US as they possibly can. I think there was some worry, certainly in the press at the beginning, that because Johnson had been seen to try and befriend Donald Trump, and indeed Joe Biden had said some slightly critical things about that that relationship might be difficult. I don't think that's the case. You know, that's politics. And when you get down to business, Biden is a pragmatist above everything else. And this government, you know, has all UK governments have worked closely with the Americans, and they will just get on with doing that. And so I don't personally think that that is a big issue.
Brilliant. Again, if you really, I'm sure our questions were found that extremely helpful. Just last two questions, I suppose, looking to the present and the past and the future in terms of Biden's legacy. The first is that if the questioner asks whether, say, if Trump could be perhaps reminiscent of the 1920s, the 1980s, in terms of, like, you know, the businessman in charge, you know, favouring free markets, business, that kind of thing, and also making America great again, maybe a throwback to Reagan. Would Carter perhaps be seen, would Biden be seen as maybe another Jimmy Carter, do you think? I think he might be seen as like a Harry Truman type figure, like, I'm too old for this kind of nonsense, I want to sort this out. Or what other identity might Biden carve out for himself? And linked to that is that one of the things you mentioned earlier as well is that, which our questions picked up on, is that systematic racism in America. Will Biden be able to fix this? What will Biden be able to do about it? Or is this going to be a longer term project for future presidents to dismantle this institutionalized racism in the United States? So I suppose basically Biden's place in history for these big issues.
Two very big questions, and very early days to make judgments. I think, you know, returning to something I said earlier, I think Biden is trying to be bold. He's trying to be transformational, I think. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One, because the moment requires it. It's a combination of what America has just been through in the last 4 years of Trump and the sort of trauma of that sort of tearing apart of the sort of bedrock of America. But it's also because of those wider systemic problems I've talked about. And it's also because of COVID and the impact that has had. So I think that combination is driving Biden to be bold. I think the second thing that's driving him to be perhaps a bit bolder than normal at this stage in a presidency is he will have in the back of his mind that he might only be a one-term president. I genuinely don't think he's decided whether he will stand or not. But, you know, he's not the youngest of presidents, and so I think he wants to get on with it. I think he wants to make his mark. Because, you know, he might not get a full 8 years. And then there's also the fact that, you know, the Democrats' control of the House and Senate is wafer thin, certainly in the Senate, but it's not that strong in the House either. And Americans have a tendency of, in the midterms in 18 months or so time, they have a tendency of penalizing the government of the day. And so Biden may well lose his majority in one or other of the two parts of Congress. And if he does, life becomes even more difficult. So he's going to try and do as much as he can early. One, in case he doesn't have control of the Senate in 2 years' time, but also in the hope, I guess, that he'll have something to show the electorate when they go to the midterms and say, look what I've done. I've kickstarted the economy, and that's now, firing on all cylinders again, and jobs are back, and you're feeling more comfortable. And so hopefully, that's his way of making sure he doesn't, or minimizes the risk of him losing that majority in the House and the Senate, and so he can continue his program. So I think we're going to see him being bold. I think he sees this as a significant moment in US history, and therefore there is an opportunity to act in a way that there might have been for Obama or Carter and so on. Whether he succeeds or not remains to be seen.
Brilliant. Well, we will see, and it means I think you've given us some good potential spoilers, I think, Patrick, in your analysis. Thank you ever so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I know that our audience do too. I'm going to sign off now after my thanks now, and because as soon as I press pause stop recording, and end, we depart. And so I suppose as well as thank you and goodbye from the audience. thank you and goodbye from me. And I really hope to the opportunity to continue our conversation another time. So thank you so much, Patrick, and good luck with the book. Remember, it's The Great American Delusion by Patrick Davies. I promise you won't regret it. It's a fantastic read, and this has been very, very enjoyable for me. So thank you, Patrick, and thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Jim. Thanks for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, thank you very much. Take care. Thank you.